He didn't stop her because she broke the law. He stopped her because he thought she didn't belong behind the wheel of a $70,000 SUV. The fluorescent lights above pump number 6 hummed softly in the cool Virginia night as Officer Daniel Carter leaned back in his patrol car, watching traffic roll slowly through the gas station lot. The digital clock on his dashboard reading 9:42 p.m., a quiet shift, the kind officers usually welcomed, until a black luxury SUV eased into the far pump, and everything about it immediately felt wrong to him in a way he couldn't explain but didn't question either, because sometimes assumptions arrive faster than evidence and louder than reason, and Daniel trusted that instinct more than he trusted silence. The SUV came to a smooth stop beside the pump with the confidence of someone who had parked there many times before, engine settling into a calm idle as the driver remained seated for a moment longer than he expected, hands resting calmly on the steering wheel as if she already knew someone was watching her from across the lot. And maybe she did, because before Daniel even opened his car door, she lifted her phone briefly to her ear and spoke a quiet sentence that the surveillance cameras above the canopy captured clearly, but Daniel never noticed, never wondered about, never asked himself why someone would make a call before an officer even approached the vehicle. He stepped out anyway, boots hitting the pavement with slow authority, adjusting his radio as he walked forward beneath the glow of white overhead lights that made every reflection on the SUV's polished surface shimmer sharply against the dark asphalt. And the closer he got, the more certain he became that something about this scene didn't match what he believed he was supposed to see tonight. Because in his mind, people who drove vehicles like this usually looked different, acted different, belonged somewhere else entirely. And that thought settled quietly into his chest like a decision already made. The driver's window lowered halfway before he reached the door, revealing a calm woman in her 40s. With composed eyes and a steady expression that didn't match the tension he had already prepared himself to confront. And for a brief second, the stillness between them felt heavier than the humming lights above them, heavier than the distant sound of traffic moving past the highway exit sign a few hundred yards away. "Evening," Daniel said, his tone controlled but firm, already reaching for his notepad before she spoke a single word, already assuming the next few minutes would follow a script he had played out many times before. But instead of confusion or apology or nervous explanation, she simply looked at him with a quiet steadiness and said, "Officer, is there a reason you chose this vehicle tonight?" And the question landed in a place he hadn't expected, because most drivers asked what they had done wrong, not why they had been chosen. Daniel cleared his throat slightly and gestured toward the SUV as if the answer were obvious to anyone standing there under the bright canopy lights, telling her he needed to confirm ownership of the vehicle, routine verification, nothing unusual, though the words sounded heavier than routine even to him as he said them. And while he spoke, he didn't notice the young cashier inside the station pause mid-conversation behind the glass window, didn't notice the couple at pump 3 glance toward the scene with sudden recognition instead of curiosity, didn't notice the older man near the ice freezer quietly lower his phone after dialing a number he clearly already knew by memory. The woman reached slowly for her license without hesitation, without irritation, without the smallest sign of surprise, as if she had expected this exact moment before the patrol car even turned into the lot. And as Daniel accepted the card from her hand, he felt something strange pass through him that he couldn't quite explain, because her name looked familiar in a way that made his radio suddenly feel louder against his shoulder, her calmness feel heavier in the air, and somewhere behind him another patrol vehicle turned into the station entrance far earlier than anyone had called for backup, its headlights sweeping across the pumps like a warning that something much bigger had already begun unfolding. Long before Officer Carter ever stepped out of his car, Officer Daniel Carter held the driver license between 2 fingers longer than necessary as the fluorescent canopy lights reflected sharply across its surface, and something about the name printed there refused to settle comfortably in his mind the way most identifications did during routine stops, because instead of confirming what he expected, it quietly challenged the assumption he had already made before stepping out of his patrol vehicle, and that unfamiliar hesitation made him straighten his shoulders, as if posture alone could restore control over a moment that was beginning to shift without his permission, while the woman remained seated calmly inside the SUV with both hands visible on the steering wheel, watching him not with fear, and not with frustration, but with a patience that felt deliberate, as though she were allowing something to unfold rather than reacting to it, and that patience unsettled him more than resistance ever would have, because resistance followed rules he understood, but silence like hers did not. Daniel turned slightly toward his patrol car and raised his radio to request a standard license verification, his voice steady at first until dispatch answered with an unexpected pause before responding, the kind of pause officers learned to recognize even if they never talked about it out loud, because it meant the system was not simply searching, it was checking something deeper than routine. And for a second Daniel considered repeating the request, but before he could speak again, dispatch replied that the identification was valid and active, and then stopped there without the usual confirmation details that normally followed, which left the air around him strangely unfinished, like a sentence cut short before the important part arrived. And he told himself it was probably just a system delay, even though the explanation did not feel convincing. Behind him, the second patrol vehicle rolled slowly closer across the lot with its headlights dimmed instead of flashing, which was unusual for a backup response that had not been requested, and Daniel glanced over his shoulder, briefly confused but unwilling to show it, as the vehicle stopped near the edge of the pumps and remained idling without its driver stepping out yet, while inside the convenience store the cashier, who had earlier paused, now spoke quietly into a phone again with his back turned toward the glass as if trying not to be noticed, and the couple at Pump 3 had stopped fueling entirely, standing still beside their sedan, watching the scene with a seriousness that did not match the calm of an ordinary traffic stop. And Daniel felt the attention gathering around him like invisible pressure he could not explain. He stepped back toward the SUV window and returned the license halfway, but did not release it immediately, choosing instead to ask how long she had owned the vehicle, though ownership had already been confirmed through the registration display on his dashboard, and the question sounded thinner than he expected even to his own ears. Yet the woman answered without hesitation, telling him she had driven the same vehicle for several years, with a tone so steady it felt rehearsed by experience rather than practiced for this moment. And when she spoke again, she asked quietly whether he intended to continue the stop or whether he planned to explain the reason for the delay, and that question landed harder than the first because it suggested she understood something he did not. At that exact moment, his radio crackled again, but instead of dispatch, another voice came through, low and urgent, asking him to confirm his location immediately using his full unit number rather than his usual call sign, and that detail alone made him pause, because supervisors only used full identifiers when situations were being monitored more closely than routine patrol required. And before he could answer, the voice repeated the request more firmly, while the second patrol vehicle behind him finally opened its driver's side door, and the officer inside stepped out slowly, not walking toward Daniel, but stopping beside his own cruiser, as though waiting for instructions that had not yet been spoken aloud. And Daniel suddenly realized that whatever had started as a simple stop beside pump number 6 was no longer following the pattern he expected, and somewhere inside the quiet stillness of the gas station lot, he felt the unmistakable sense that the system he trusted to support his decisions had already begun reacting to something he had not yet understood. Officer Daniel Carter kept his radio close to his shoulder longer than necessary after the supervisor's voice requested his full unit identifier again, because something about the tone did not sound like routine coordination and more like confirmation that someone else somewhere beyond the gas station canopy lights was already watching the situation unfold in real time, and that realization created a quiet pressure behind his ribs that he refused to acknowledge as concern, while the second officer, who had stepped out of the backup vehicle, remained standing beside his cruiser instead of approaching, which was not how assistance normally worked during a roadside stop, and Daniel noticed that hesitation immediately, because officers usually moved forward together unless someone had instructed them to hold position, and that detail alone made the scene feel different in a way he could not yet explain. He answered the radio with his location, trying to keep his voice steady, but dispatch did not respond right away, and instead another brief silence followed, the kind that stretched just long enough to make him aware of the soft hum of the fuel pumps, the faint rattle of a passing pickup truck on the nearby highway exit ramp, and the quiet movement of people inside the convenience store who were now clearly watching through the glass rather than pretending not to notice what was happening outside, while the woman in the driver's seat of the SUV remained completely still, her posture unchanged, her hands still resting calmly on the steering wheel, as if the growing attention around the scene had already been expected. And when Daniel finally released her license back into her hand, she accepted it slowly with the same composed expression she had shown since the beginning of the stop, which somehow made the silence feel heavier instead of lighter. The backup officer behind him shifted his weight slightly and raised his own radio, but did not speak, and Daniel turned halfway toward him expecting support or at least a routine question about the reason for the stop, yet the officer only met his eyes briefly before looking away toward the convenience store entrance, where the cashier had now stepped outside, holding the door open without saying anything, as though waiting for someone else to arrive. And Daniel felt a sudden awareness that the people around the pumps were no longer behaving like bystanders, but like witnesses who already understood something he had not yet recognized. His radio crackled again, and this time the supervisor's voice returned more direct than before, asking him to confirm whether the driver remained at the scene and whether any enforcement action had been taken yet. And the wording of the question immediately caught his attention, because supervisors did not normally ask about enforcement decisions unless those decisions were being evaluated while they were happening, and Daniel answered that the driver was still present and that he was continuing the verification process, even though he realized as he spoke that the verification had already been completed minutes earlier, which meant he was now continuing the stop for reasons he could not clearly justify even to himself. The woman finally spoke again, her voice quiet but unmistakably steady, asking whether he intended to keep her there much longer, because she had somewhere she needed to be, and the calm certainty in her tone made the question sound less like impatience and more like a reminder that time itself had already started moving in a direction neither of them could reverse. And before Daniel could respond, another vehicle turned into the gas station lot from the main road, slowing near the edge of the pumps without its headlights switching off, as though the driver wanted a clear view of everything happening beneath the canopy lights. And Daniel suddenly understood that whatever attention had begun gathering around pump number 6 was no longer accidental, and somewhere beyond the reach of his patrol radio someone else had already decided that this stop was about to become something far more important than he had ever intended it to be. Officer Daniel Carter became aware of the third vehicle before he even turned his head, because the quiet shift in the air beneath the canopy lights carried a different kind of presence than the earlier arrivals. And when he finally looked toward the edge of the gas station lot, he noticed it was not a patrol unit and not a customer pulling in for fuel, but a dark government sedan that stopped near the outer curb line without turning off its engine, as though whoever sat inside intended to remain exactly where they were watching without stepping forward yet. And that detail alone made the scene feel less like a routine stop and more like a moment being observed from somewhere beyond his control, while the backup officer behind him now stood straighter beside his cruiser with his radio lowered instead of raised, which Daniel recognized immediately as the posture officers used when they were waiting for direction rather than offering assistance. And that realization made him glance once more toward the driver of the SUV, who remained seated exactly as she had been since the beginning, calm, patient, and entirely unhurried, as if the passage of minutes no longer mattered to her in the same way it mattered to everyone else standing under the bright canopy lights. Inside the convenience store, the cashier stepped farther outside, holding the door open wider than before, and spoke quietly to someone still inside, while two customers near the ice freezer moved closer to the glass window instead of returning to their vehicles. And Daniel suddenly understood that none of them were watching with curiosity anymore. They were watching with recognition, and that difference changed everything, even if he did not yet understand why. His radio crackled again, but this time it was not the supervisor and not dispatch, but a voice from Central Coordination asking him to confirm whether the driver had been asked to exit the vehicle yet. And the wording of that question immediately caught his attention, because it suggested that someone outside his immediate chain of command was now following the details of the stop step by step. And Daniel answered that the driver remained inside while continuing his verification, even though he knew the verification process had already ended several minutes earlier. And the moment he finished Speaking, he realized that continuing to hold her there without a clear explanation was no longer something he could describe as routine. The woman turned her head slightly toward the dark sedan at the edge of the lot, as if she had noticed its arrival long before he had, and when she looked back at him, her expression remained steady, but her voice carried a quiet certainty as she asked whether his department normally delayed drivers after confirming identification or whether tonight was an exception, and the question settled heavily between them because it was not asked with irritation or accusation, but with the calm tone of someone documenting a sequence of events rather than reacting to them, and Daniel felt the weight of that difference, even if he could not yet explain why it mattered. Behind him, the backup officer finally spoke into his radio, but kept his voice low enough that Daniel could not hear the words clearly, and within seconds the door of the dark sedan opened, and a man stepped out wearing a plain jacket instead of a uniform, walking only halfway toward the pumps before stopping as though he had reached exactly the distance he intended to maintain, and Daniel felt a sudden awareness that this was no longer a situation unfolding around him, but a situation unfolding above him, and before he could decide what to say next, his radio came alive once more with a calm, unfamiliar voice asking him one direct question that made the night air beneath the canopy lights feel completely still as it waited for his answer. The unfamiliar voice on Officer Daniel Carter's radio did not introduce itself and did not explain why it was speaking to him directly, and that alone made the question feel heavier than anything he had heard since the stop began, because it did not sound like dispatch, and it did not sound like supervision. And when the voice asked him to confirm whether he had initiated a discretionary vehicle stop without a reported violation, Daniel felt the words settle into the space around him like something already documented rather than something still being decided, and for the first time that night, he hesitated before answering, because the difference between routine action and discretionary action suddenly mattered more than he expected, while the quiet hum of the gas station canopy lights continued overhead, and the second officer, near his cruiser, shifted his stance again, not moving closer, but not leaving either, as though he already understood that whatever answer Daniel gave next would shape what happened from that moment forward. Daniel cleared his throat slightly and responded that he had stopped the vehicle based on observable concerns related to ownership verification, even though he realized as he spoke that the explanation sounded thinner now than it had earlier, because the registration had already confirmed lawful ownership minutes before, and the voice on the radio did not reply immediately, which created another long silence that stretched across the fuel pumps, the parking lines, the convenience store windows, and the small circle of people who were now clearly watching without pretending otherwise, while the man in the plain jacket who had stepped out of the dark sedan remained halfway between the curb and the pumps, standing still with his hands at his sides, as though waiting for something he already expected to happen. Inside the SUV, the driver listened quietly without interrupting, and when she finally spoke again, her tone remained steady as she asked whether the stop was still active or whether she was now being delayed after verification had already been completed, and Daniel realized the wording of her question was precise in a way most drivers never use during traffic stops, because it separated the original decision from what was happening now, and that distinction made the air feel tighter beneath the canopy lights, while his radio finally responded again, with the same unfamiliar voice calmly requesting that he confirm whether he had informed the driver of the reason for continued detention and whether any additional enforcement action had been initiated yet, and Daniel felt the weight of those words immediately, because they sounded less like routine coordination and more like a record being built sentence by sentence, in real time. Behind him, the backup officer lowered his radio again and glanced briefly toward the man in the plain jacket who had taken another slow step closer, without crossing the painted line that marked the fuel lane boundary, and Daniel suddenly understood that the distance the man maintained was not hesitation but intention, as though he already knew exactly how close he needed to be without becoming part of the stop itself, while the cashier near the convenience store entrance stepped fully outside, now standing beside the door with his phone lowered but still in his hand, as if ready to continue recording the moment something changed. Daniel looked back toward the driver of the SUV, expecting frustration or impatience, but instead he saw the same calm expression she had carried since the beginning, and when she spoke again, she said only that she hoped the situation would be resolved quickly because she had already informed someone she would be delayed, and that simple sentence settled into his thoughts with unexpected weight because it suggested that whatever attention had begun gathering around pump number 6 had not started with the arrival of backup vehicles or the appearance of the dark sedan, but with something she had done quietly before he ever reached her window. And before he could respond, the unfamiliar voice on his radio spoke once more, asking him to confirm the driver's full name aloud for verification. And the moment the request reached his ears, Daniel realized that whatever came next was no longer going to remain a routine stop. Officer Daniel Carter did not immediately answer the request on his radio because repeating the driver's full name aloud suddenly felt different from everything he had done since stepping out of his patrol vehicle, and for the first time that night, he became aware that the simple act of speaking her name was no longer part of a routine verification, but part of something being confirmed somewhere beyond the gas station canopy lights, while the unfamiliar voice waited without repeating the request, and that silence alone carried more weight than any instruction he had heard earlier, because it suggested the answer already mattered before he even gave it. He looked once more at the woman seated behind the wheel and noticed that she was not watching him the way most drivers watched officers during traffic stops, with uncertainty or tension, but instead with the quiet patience of someone who already understood what was about to happen next. And when she spoke, her voice remained steady as she said that if he needed her full name, he could simply read it from the license he had already returned moments earlier, and the calm certainty in that sentence made Daniel aware that everyone within view of pump number 6 now seemed to be waiting for the same thing he was avoiding. Behind him, the backup officer shifted again but did not move closer, and the man in the plain jacket near the edge of the fuel lane had taken another slow step forward, stopping just inside the canopy light, where his face was finally visible, yet he still did not speak or approach, as though he intended to remain exactly where he was until Daniel said what the radio was asking him to say, while inside the convenience store the cashier no longer pretended to be occupied with anything else, and the couple near pump 3 had stopped watching quietly and were now clearly listening for something they expected to hear. Daniel finally lifted the radio slightly closer to his shoulder and read the name from memory instead of looking down at the license again, and the moment he spoke the words Vanessa Brooks into the microphone, the response came back immediately, without hesitation, without confirmation delay, and without the routine tone dispatch normally used, as the same unfamiliar voice answered with calm clarity, instructing him to remain exactly where he was, and to take no further enforcement action until a supervisor arrived on site. And that instruction changed the meaning of everything that had happened during the last several minutes. Because supervisors were not sent for completed stops, they were sent for situations that had already become something else entirely. Daniel felt the shift before anyone else moved. Because the backup officer behind him lowered his shoulders slightly as though he had expected that instruction, and the man in the plain jacket took one final step forward, stopping within clear speaking distance of the SUV, but still not crossing the invisible boundary of the stop itself, while the woman behind the wheel finally rested her hands more comfortably against the steering wheel, as if the waiting portion of the evening had already ended for her, even though nothing had been resolved yet. Daniel pressed the radio once more, asking whether there was a problem with the stop, and the unfamiliar voice answered only that the situation was being reviewed at a higher level, and that he should remain patient until the arriving supervisor made contact, and the careful wording of that response made it clear that whatever was happening now was no longer being handled inside the normal rhythm of patrol operations, while the dark sedan at the edge of the lot remained exactly where it had been since arriving, its engine still running, its headlights still pointed toward the pumps, as though the person inside had been waiting not for the stop itself, but for the moment Daniel finally spoke the name that confirmed everything. And as the quiet hum of the canopy lights continued overhead, he realized with growing certainty that the moment he had said her name aloud was the exact moment the stop stopped belonging to him. The moment Officer Daniel Carter finished hearing the instruction to remain exactly where he was and take no further enforcement action, the atmosphere beneath the canopy lights shifted in a way that did not require anyone to speak, because even the quiet sounds of the fuel pumps and distant highway traffic suddenly seemed farther away, as though the space around pump number 6 had become its own separate place inside the larger night. While the backup officer beside his cruiser straightened slightly and lowered his radio completely, no longer pretending he might step forward to assist, and instead standing with the still posture of someone waiting for authority to arrive from somewhere higher than either of them. Daniel glanced once more toward the dark sedan parked near the edge of the lot, and this time the driver's door opened fully as the man in the plain jacket began walking forward with slow, deliberate steps that did not match the pace of someone responding to urgency, but the confidence of someone arriving exactly when expected. And as he moved closer, the people near the convenience store entrance shifted slightly to give him space without being asked, which told Daniel more than any badge could have, because strangers did not move that way unless they recognized the role someone carried, even without a uniform. The man stopped several feet short of the SUV and nodded once toward the driver before turning his attention calmly toward Daniel. And although he did not introduce himself immediately, the silence around them made his presence feel official in a way that required no explanation. While the woman behind the wheel finally rested one hand lightly against the door frame instead of the steering wheel, as though the waiting portion of the stop had already ended for her, and Daniel realized that her posture had changed before anyone else spoke a single word. His radio crackled again, but this time it was not the unfamiliar voice from earlier and not dispatch, but his own precinct supervisor confirming that he was only minutes away from the location and instructing him again to maintain the scene exactly as it was, which made it clear that whatever review had begun after the name was spoken aloud was still unfolding beyond his view, and that realization settled into his thoughts with unexpected weight, because supervisors did not repeat instructions unless the details already mattered somewhere else. The man in the plain jacket finally spoke, quietly introducing himself only by first name and department affiliation without specifying his role, yet his tone carried the calm assurance of someone who expected cooperation rather than requested it, and he asked Daniel a single question about when the stop had started, which Daniel answered automatically, even as he became aware that the exact time now sounded more important than the reason the stop had begun, while the backup officer behind him shifted again, taking a half step closer to his cruiser door instead of toward the SUV, as though preparing to stand clear rather than participate. The supervisor's vehicle turned into the gas station lot seconds later, its headlights sweeping across the pumps before stopping near the canopy edge, and Daniel watched as his supervisor stepped out quickly, but walked first toward the man in the plain jacket instead of toward him, which was not how routine oversight normally worked, and the two exchanged a brief, quiet conversation that Daniel could not hear from where he stood before both of them turned at the same time toward the driver of the SUV, and in that moment, he understood with sudden clarity that the focus of the entire scene had never really been on the stop itself, but on the person he had chosen to stop, and as the supervisor began walking toward him with a different expression than Daniel had ever seen before. During a traffic encounter, he realized that whatever explanation he had expected to give was no longer the explanation anyone was waiting to hear. Supervisor Mark Reynolds did not speak to Officer Daniel Carter immediately when he reached him, and that silence alone carried more weight than any instruction he could have given, because supervisors usually asked questions first, but tonight Reynolds stood beside him for a moment longer than expected, looking instead toward the driver of the SUV with a level of respect Daniel had never seen directed toward someone during a roadside stop, and when Reynolds finally spoke, his voice remained calm but careful as he asked Daniel to step slightly aside with him away from the pump lane boundary, which was not a request he normally made in front of a driver, and that difference alone made the night air feel sharper beneath the canopy lights, while the man in the plain jacket remained positioned exactly where he had stopped earlier, watching the exchange without interruption, as though confirming each step of what happened next. Reynolds lowered his voice and asked Daniel to explain again what reason he had given for initiating the stop, and Daniel repeated the same explanation about ownership verification, even though he could already feel that the words no longer sounded complete enough to hold the moment together, and Reynolds listened without interrupting, but did not nod the way he usually did during routine conversations, which made Daniel realize that the explanation was being heard differently now than it had been earlier, while behind them the backup officer quietly moved closer to his cruiser door, not entering the vehicle, but clearly preparing to clear the lane if necessary, as though the stop itself had already reached a point where normal patrol positioning no longer applied. Reynolds then asked one more question about Whether Daniel had informed the driver she was free to leave after the registration confirmation, and Daniel hesitated because the answer to that question mattered in a way he had not considered earlier. And before he could respond, Reynolds glanced briefly toward the SUV again, where the driver remained seated calmly with her window still lowered, her posture unchanged, her expression steady, as if she had been waiting not for permission, but for acknowledgement, and Reynolds exhaled slowly before stepping forward toward the vehicle himself, stopping a respectful distance from the driver's door and addressing her directly by name in a tone that carried unmistakable recognition rather than uncertainty. When he spoke her name aloud, Daniel understood immediately that the recognition was not new information, but confirmation of something already known by the people who had begun arriving minutes earlier, and the man in the plain jacket moved one step closer only after Reynolds finished speaking, as though his presence now belonged inside the conversation instead of outside it, while the people near the convenience store entrance remained completely still, watching without speaking, as if they understood that the moment unfolding beneath the canopy lights had already become something larger than a traffic encounter. Reynolds then turned back toward Daniel with a different expression than he had carried when stepping out of his vehicle moments earlier, and quietly informed him that the stop would now be documented as a reviewed contact rather than a completed enforcement action, and that instruction alone changed the meaning of everything that had happened since the patrol car first entered the gas station lot. Because reviewed contacts were not written in isolation, they were examined in sequence with every decision that followed them, and Daniel felt that realization settle into his thoughts with unexpected weight as Reynolds asked him to remain available for a follow-up report once the scene was cleared, while the man in the plain jacket finally spoke again, addressing Reynolds directly, with a brief confirmation that additional documentation would be coordinated through the appropriate office, and Daniel suddenly understood that whatever explanation he had prepared earlier was no longer the explanation anyone needed, because the moment Reynolds stepped back from the SUV after speaking with the driver, it became clear that the outcome of the stop had already begun moving beyond the gas station long before anyone officially said the words. That would explain why Officer Daniel Carter remained standing beside Supervisor Mark Reynolds for several seconds after the conversation near the driver's window ended, because even without hearing every word that had been spoken, he could already feel that the quiet tone Reynolds used with Vanessa Brooks carried a level of recognition that explained why the stop had changed direction so quickly. And when Reynolds finally stepped back toward him, the expression on his face was not anger and not confusion, but something steadier and more deliberate, as though he had already accepted that the situation unfolding beneath the canopy lights would continue long after the patrol vehicles left the gas station lot, while the man in the plain jacket spoke briefly with Brooks through the open window, and then stepped back again without interrupting her departure preparations, which told Daniel that whatever coordination had brought him there had already been completed. Exactly as intended, Brooks rested her hands calmly on the steering wheel again, and for the first time since the stop began, she shifted her attention toward Daniel, directly meeting his eyes with a steady expression that did not carry accusation and did not carry resentment, but instead carried something quieter and more permanent than either of those things, as she said only that she appreciated his patience while the situation was clarified, and the calm certainty of her voice made the sentence sound less like closure and more like documentation of a moment that would not be forgotten once the canopy lights faded behind her vehicle. Reynolds then informed Daniel that the contact would be reviewed through the appropriate channels, and that he should prepare a complete written account before the end of his shift, including the exact time sequence beginning with his arrival in the gas station lot, and Daniel understood immediately that the wording of that instruction meant every detail now mattered in a way routine stops rarely required, because reviewed contacts followed different paths than ordinary reports, and those paths did not end at the edge of a patrol shift, while the backup officer quietly returned to his cruiser, and the people near the convenience store entrance slowly began moving again, as though the pause that had held them in place for the last several minutes had finally been released. Brooks started the engine with the same calm confidence she had shown from the beginning and eased the SUV forward past the fuel pumps without hesitation, and as she passed Reynolds, he nodded once with clear respect before stepping aside to give her space to exit the lot, and Daniel watched the vehicle move toward the roadway, until its headlights blended with the steady flow of traffic beyond the station entrance, realizing that the moment the SUV left the property, the stop itself had already become something else entirely, because it no longer existed only beneath the canopy lights where it began, but inside the reports that would now follow it. Reynolds remained beside him for another quiet moment before reminding him that decisions made in ordinary places sometimes carried consequences that traveled far beyond those places, and that understanding the difference between suspicion and certainty was part of the responsibility that came with every patrol shift. And as Reynolds returned to his vehicle, Daniel looked once more across the gas station lot, noticing how normal everything appeared again, the pumps humming softly, the store lights glowing behind the glass, the highway traffic moving steadily in the distance. And yet he understood with growing clarity that what had happened at pump number 6 would continue long after the night itself ended, because somewhere beyond the reach of the patrol radio and the canopy lights above him, a record of the stop had already begun moving forward through channels he could not see. And as he stepped back toward his cruiser, he realized that the quietest moments of a shift were sometimes the ones that changed everything.